Welcome, everyone. You are listening to the new episode of the Votes and Seats podcast series of the Center for Political Science at Mathias Corvinus Collegium. Today, we will talk about the recent UK general election, with particular attention paid to the campaign, the key messages and topics communicated by the parties, the election results, the winners and losers of the election, as well as the prospects of the new government. And I have the honor to do so with Paul Gilfillan, Senior Lecturer in Sociology at the Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. Mr. Gilfillan was also visiting fellow at MCC in recent years. Professor, thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a true pleasure to have you today.
Thank you, Farage. It's a pleasure to be here to chat with you this afternoon.
Um, Labour has won in a landslide, more than doubling the number of its seats, while the Conservatives have suffered a historical defeat, losing roughly two-thirds of its seats in the House of Commons. In the meantime, the Liberal Democrats and Farage's Reform Party can be satisfied with the result, which is apparently not true for the Scottish National Party. What do you find personally the most interesting or surprising about the election results, and why?
I suppose to begin at the beginning, Farage, clearly the Labour Party, as you mentioned, have won a fantastic majority of seats in the House of Commons. So that's the number one story. But of course, also that means the other story is the Conservatives had a complete disaster. To lose 251 seats is astonishing. And so both of those are the story, Farage. Was I surprised at the result? Yes, I was surprised at the extent of the decline in the Conservative share of the vote, I must say. Something that's very important to understand, Farage, in the British context is the first past the post system, which means, as it has meant last Thursday, even with a modest percentage of the vote. So, for example, the Labour Party, believe it or not, only increased their share of the vote last Thursday by 0.5%. So something like 34% of the electorate voted for the Labour Party. And to explain why they have such a huge majority, you have to understand the first past the post system and the other part of the story, the tremendous decline in the Conservative share of the vote. So I wasn't surprised that Labour won. I wasn't surprised that the Conservative lost seats, but the scale, Farage, I must admit, it did take me certainly by surprise. In the Scottish context, not so much so. In the Scottish context, we can get into this shortly, Farage, but in the Scottish context, the tremendous defeat suffered by the Scottish National Party, that was very much predicted, and that didn't surprise me at all. So yeah, and the kind of the tremendous victory for Reform UK and the vagaries of the political first past the post system, Farage, would explain why, for example, the Liberal Democrats did very well again last Thursday.
And if we take a step back, what was the campaign like? How do you feel? Did you see any novel or innovative element in the campaign compared to previous general election campaigns in the UK?
Not particularly, Farage. Not particularly. It was the usual kind of, very much staged affair. All the parties are very, they have professionals who organise all kinds of events, etc. There was a kind of motif, for example, with the Liberal Democrat Party of their leader Ed Davey every day having some kind of photo opportunity stunt in order to garner publicity, etc. But you must remember, Farage, you're speaking to a sociologist, and I as a broad rule, Farage, my view would be the result is not particularly impacted by the actual campaign. For example, I briefly mentioned about the Scottish context. Such has been the horror show or the disastrous infighting of the SNP, for example, the kind of the governing party in Scotland, Farage. This has been going on for years. that by the time the actual 3 or 4 weeks of the election campaign begin, my suspicion, Sabot, is that people's minds are already made up. But having said that, one of the features of the Conservative Party's campaign was a kind of putting their foot in it all the time. There was all these stories, for example, about people close to the Prime Minister betting as to when an election would be held or perhaps the outcome. So there was a lot of kind of negative publicity. Things like Rishi Sunak leaving a war memorial event early, etc., and the mistakes that was, etc. So there was the usual kind of day-to-day issues, Saboch. But honestly, as a sociologist, I think the die is cast prior to the actual 2-3 weeks of arranged and staged events. To be honest.
Okay, and if we look at the maybe we should look at the past 5-year term overall or the dynamics and tendencies, and if we take a step to the campaign topics, key messages, which were those, and did they matter at all, or was this decision already decided in advance? Only the extent of and the vote shares, the seat shares were unknown. So how do you see all these? What about illegal immigration, the state of the economy, the NHS, etc.? So what were the key issues, and did they matter at all for the voters?
Yes, certainly the issues like the economy and immigration, Saboch, mattered very, very much. So, for example, one of the motifs of the Labour Party was to end the chaos. So, vote for the Labour Party to end the Tory chaos. So, the tremendously high rates of inflation, etc., and of course the cost of living crisis in the UK. There's a lot of people who have been very badly hit by the tremendous increase in the utility bills, etc. And it's well established that something like one in 5 people in the UK are in poverty. So absolutely, the idea of each party pitching for political competence, Saboch, was very key to the whole campaign. And I think, given the recent track record of the Conservatives in terms of the economy, I think it was absolutely important that Keir Starmer didn't overpromise, and he did that. He didn't, for example, he was very, very careful to say that if a Labour government was elected, they would not suddenly increase taxation, they would not suddenly increase spending. And that kind of cautious approach went down very well with the electorate, Saboch. Now, of course, many people criticised people like Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, and they would criticise her for saying that, sticking with Conservative Party tax and spending policies, that's not actually change. That's simply continuing with what's gone before. But of course, to counter that, Starmer always said we wanted to steady the ship, and so to stop the kind of the chaos of the of economic policy under the Tories. And it seems to have very much played well. Academic research, which is quite clear that, for example, the Labour Party, it is no longer the party of, say, the working class. It is now, if you like, the political home of quite comfortable middle-class voters. And certainly that message of economic stability went down very well with a lot of the electorate. Another hugely important issue, Saboch, immigration or illegal immigration. One of the things you have to appreciate in the UK context is that on a more or less daily basis, people in the United Kingdom, when they switch on their evening news, we see pictures of illegal immigrants crossing the Channel from France. Now, one of the clear policy dividing lines between the Conservatives in this election and the Labour Party was the policy on illegal migration. Perhaps you know about Rishi Sunak's determination to have the Rwanda policy, so to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda for processing. The Labour Party was very clear that that policy would be scrapped under a Labour Party, and so we now have this promise by the new Home Secretary that there's going to be a new agency to look at illegal migration, etc. So that's a clear policy choice and a clear division. And I think one of the things that explains the tremendous rise in the Reform UK vote was precisely because, despite the attempts of the Conservative Party to address this problem of illegal immigration, many Conservatives no longer think it's credible. And certainly Nigel Farage and the Reform UK Party would be seen as people who would be much more effective in tackling this problem in a way that I would suspect most people would not imagine that the new Home Secretary for the Labour Party will be as effective. So those two issues, Saboch, very, very key. Economy and illegal immigration, yes.
And what about the war in Ukraine? Did it appear in the campaign on the agenda? Did any party bring it to the agenda? And if so, was it a dividing line in terms of the positions of the parties?
I think, Saboch, it was not. It didn't play tremendously in the campaign. I noticed that Starmer has said in Washington at the NATO summit that there has been a change in the UK government, but he said he was very keen to emphasise in his meetings with NATO representatives and Joe Biden that there will not be a change in UK policy vis-a-vis being seen to help aid Ukraine militarily in the war against Russia. So I didn't think it played very much, that particular issue, Saboch. And if it did, Starmer has already indicated continuity of policy.
The turnout in this election was significantly below the level, and maybe the lowest since 2001. Was significantly below the level seen 5 years ago by more than 7 percentage points. Can we argue that many citizens have turned their backs on politics? And if so, in your opinion, what explains this apathy, or what kind of symptom is this? People are no longer interested in politics. They do not believe in politicians, or what could be the explanation? We already touched upon voter behavior a bit.
Yes, probably all of those reasons are part of the explanation, Saboch. You're right. This result saw a very low turnout, comparable to 2001. So the Tony Blair's election. This has been a long time coming, I suppose, Saboch. Back in the 1950s, you would have, for example, election turnouts of 80%, and in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, you would still see very, very high turnouts. So I think, in terms of explanations as to why that there's it's not just a particular election, Saboch, but it's a kind of post-war phenomenon, really. I think the main reason is, if you like, the tremendous rise in people's expectations in terms of the material standards of living have risen so much that, if you like, we now enter into a kind of post-materialist politics. The great issues of bread, housing, want, etc., these great rallying cries of politics in the post-war period, in many ways, they've been successfully met. So we now have this new kinds of politics, a kind of post-materialist politics, a kind of post-class politics. So just the kinds of issues and policies that politicians and the electorate are concerned about, Sabo, is fundamentally changed, I think. In the UK context, from the 1970s and 1980s, we see the advent of generalised affluence to the entire population. And so that fundamentally filters through as to what politics is about. I mentioned previously that, for example, the Labour Party, founded well over a century ago, it was founded to represent in Parliament manual workers. That's simply no longer the case. The Labour Party is more of a home to very comfortable middle class people. So there's been a tremendous change as to what politics is about, and political parties have had to adapt. So, for example, we now have politics of identity. There's a culture term. We are now interested in culture wars. These hot button issues, Sab, which are only possible once you've solved the problem of bread. There's a famous tract written in the early 20th century by Kropotkin called The Conquest of Bread. And so once that happens, politics becomes about something else. So when you no longer have that kind of visceral, material, direct relationship to politics, essentially people are able to be indifferent in a way that simply wasn't possible before. So that kind of very broadly would explain why we see a decline in political participation.
Now turning to the prospects of the new government and the winning Labour, the most important slogan used by Starmer has probably been country first, party second. And in his first public speeches as PM, he stressed that changes have already started in itself by setting up this new government with a completely different mindset, but concrete deliveries will come only later. What can be the first specific measures of the new government? What do you think?
Well, I was very interested to see the chorus, the refrain of Labour was that this election was about change. And when I kind of sitting there listening with my pen and paper at the ready, I must admit I didn't see where exactly the change was going to come from, what exactly that was meant by change. I can understand the idea of no longer having a kind of chaotic Conservative Party at the helm, so to speak. But I must admit, I'm a bit sceptical, Saboch, as to how exactly this new government is going to engineer the change that we want. I noticed, for example, that the Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, in her very first speech as Chancellor, she talked about wanting to change substantially planning laws, which basically means making it easier for house builders to build on green belt land, etc. Now, that is not something that you would immediately identify with it as a kind of left or centre agenda for change. Certainly, in terms of rhetoric, there are the usual stated goals, Saboch: ending child poverty, reducing, poverty-related education gaps, etc. Now, that is a devilishly tricky problem to solve, especially if, I think, as Rachel Reeves said, the money available for new initiatives is very, very modest indeed. So, to be honest, I'm not sure where exactly this, without new monies, without growth in the economy, in order to generate, greater revenue via the tax base, etc. Saboch. To be honest, I'm not quite sure where the change is going to come from. Things, for example, announced during the campaign, for example, a new energy strategy. So the Labour government want to create something called Great Britain Energy, a kind of new company in order to reduce electricity bills, gas bills, in order to reduce the UK's dependency on foreign sources of energy, etc., and to kind of create renewable jobs, etc. All of that sounds like change, etc. But of course, it will be it will have to be seen in the weeks and months coming, Saboch, as to whether or not the new government can deliver these changes that people want.
And how big is the risk of widespread dissatisfaction and disillusionment that may arise towards the new administration if it fails to deliver actually, or how long can it survive without any meaningful measures and just keeping the idea, promising the idea all the time of changes, etc. So how long and how can this how big is the trust in this society or in the voters towards this
I think the risk of disappointment is almost certain, Saboch. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he mentioned how there are some kind of rumors about, for example, the state pension being means tested, and that is not something that was ever promised in the general election campaign. And I think, to be honest, maybe it's because I'm older and have seen governments promise all kinds of things. I remember back in 1997, for example, Saboch, many moons ago, when I was, at that time, I was actually an SNP constituency organizer. And no matter what we did in terms of working hard to increase our particular vote, the tsunami of change in terms of voting in a Labour government is irresistible. And of course, there was this tremendous wave of enthusiasm and energy and goodwill. Now, that was back in May 1997. And of course, reflecting back on his years in government, Saboch, Tony Blair famously said, for example, that in order to truly make an impact in cutting poverty, his government should have been far more radical from the very get-go. Now, I do not see any kind of rhetoric from Keir Starmer at that kind of level of social change, Saboch. So I think disillusionment is only a matter of when, not if, to be perfectly honest. It's just in order to truly engineer social change or address poverty, you fundamentally have to change social conditions. And unless you radically intervene in terms of redistribution of wealth, I just do not see how that is possible, to be perfectly honest. There's an old kind of sociological truism that goes something along the lines of, if you want to change outcomes, then you must change conditions. And I simply don't see that. I don't see that anywhere in the Labour Party manifesto. So I think the risk of widespread dissatisfaction, which is pretty much 100%. And I think it's going to come very soon.
Now, if you look at the list of secretaries of state in the new cabinet and the composition of the new cabinet, can we make some cautious predictions about the possible future policy directions? Do you know these figures and what can be expected of them as government members?
I'm not familiar with many of them. Clearly, this will be their first time being appointed minister, Saboch. One of the things that's playing very much in the British media is that there's a very clear majority of ministers who have had state educations. Previously and famously, even under Tory and Labour Party governments, most cabinet ministers had a kind of very privileged educational background. This seems to be not the case this time round, Saboch. So the press, rightly, is making something of that. But what that translates in terms of policy or social engineering, etc., Saboch, that remains to be seen. Personal trajectories are one thing, but trying to engineer change at a population-wide level, that's an entirely different thing.
And now turning to the Conservative Party, which must be in a very, very poor condition after such a devastating defeat. How do you see? Can it recover somehow in the foreseeable future? Can Sunak somehow survive, even remain party leader for even a couple of years? And if you were a political advisor, which is, of course, you're not, but what would you recommend to the Tories? What should they do now?
Well, I think what's going to be really interesting in terms of the Conservative Party moving forward, Saboch, is relationship that's established between them and Reform UK. Nigel Farage and his 4 other Reform UK members of Parliament, I very much predict that Farage is going to be a thorn in the side of the Conservative Party for the next 4 years. It's going to be really interesting as to whether or not the British Conservative Party shifts in terms of its policy thanks to the rise of the Reform Party. I think that's going to be really quite crucial. I think that's, I mean, for example, Reform UK got something like 14% of the vote. So clearly, a lot of the explanation as to why the Conservative vote fell so much last Thursday is because Reform UK's vote went up quite spectacularly, really, to 14.3%. So that conversation, whether the Conservative Party has to tack to the right in order to offset. I mean, unfortunately, Savoch, we don't have a crystal ball, but for example, it is certainly conceivable that if, as Farage wants, that he wants to, if you like, be the successor party to the Conservative, a kind of a new Conservative Party in Reform UK, that can have all kinds of repercussions going forward. For example, if it was indeed possible that Reform could establish itself and increase its vote, you could see it, you know, in terms of this. So this historic disappointment of the Conservative Party, it might be the beginning of the end of the Conservative Party as the kind of natural home to centre-right voters in the English context. That's speculation, of course, but it really is interesting. And it also, in terms of the Scottish context, of course, Reform UK, their vote also went up in the Scottish context, but not as much as the English context. So again, I think what's really interesting going forward for me, Savoch, is where does a conservative nationalism, where does it find its political home in the English and the Scottish context? Clearly, in the English context, Reform UK might be that party. I think one of the interesting things in the Scottish context, Savoch, looking forward is, for me, one of the interesting things about this result is that for the first time ever, perhaps, the social, cultural, political movement that is Scottish nationalism is now distinct from the Scottish National Party. And that's new. I think one of the things that might happen in the Scottish context is that if we were to have formed a right-wing or a conservative nationalist party, that could be a game changer. It might be interesting for some of your listeners, Savoch, to know that Scotland is a kind of quite a kind of strange place. It's one of the very few countries in Europe that doesn't have a centre-right nationalist party. I recently wrote some stuff for the European Conservative, trying to figure out why that was. But certainly because of this now, because of the quite sharp decline, something like 15% in the SNP vote, many nationalists are no longer giving their vote to the Scottish National Party. So where does their vote go to? Now, unless you have a kind of a centre-right or a conservative nationalist party, that vote might become frustrated and not find a political home. So I think going forward that could be interesting. But as I mentioned, in the English context, Nigel Farage seems to have analysed that particular demographic in a way that is not that isn't possible yet in the Scottish context. I think you asked me about can the Conservative Party recover it. So yeah, that would be my answer, Savoch. It would be fantastic to have a crystal ball, but unfortunately we don't.
And my last question will somehow continue what you just started, or how you ended your answer to the previous question, is about the structure of the party competition, even the party system. So the changes we just see and the trends you just identified a couple of minutes earlier, do you expect these to be durable in the longer run, or just temporary? And if we return to the beginning of our conversation, the FPTP system, does it enable any restructuring in the party system, in the party competition at all? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, Saboch. For example, we see in the French context, the kind of cobbling together of new political alliances in order to prevent Marie Le Pen, etc., getting voting in. So we might see something similar in the UK context. I think it's a fantastic question in terms of where one of the clear problems affecting Western European policies is the rise of the conservative nationalism. And how does traditional liberal parties respond to this? Do they borrow some policies, or do they, batten down the hatches and declare a kind of an ongoing kind of culture war with these forces? I think this is so much is still to be played for. I think there is absolutely a kind of tectonic shift that's going on in terms of the configuration of politics. One of the interesting things, for example, is where does the working class vote go to in the English and the Scottish context? Oftentimes, there is good academic research, for example, that would say increasingly working class demographics feel unrepresented, and a kind of shift to the centre. Increasingly working class voters don't feel as if mainstream parties represent them anymore. So that again could be a demographic from which would help to facilitate this a restructuring of the political parties. So I think the two things, there is this volatile demographic voters that are out there. Crucially, what kind of political form it takes, it will rely, I suppose, Saboch, on are there political entrepreneurs in the Scottish or English context that are able to take advantage of that and to canalise it and represent it. But another thing that I'm sure is going to be talked about at great length is, for example, many people coming, especially, for example, from Reform UK, are saying that, they're saying to the media, look, last Thursday we received 14.3% of the vote from the people. However, because of this first past the post system, only 1% of the MPs sitting in the House of Commons are from Reform UK. So they're going to be clearly saying we need to reform the voting system. We have a very undemocratic voting system in the UK. It's certainly not representative. Now, and that's true. I don't think that's a kind of false claim. The gap between the percentage of votes received and the percentage of seats gained in the House of Commons is something like 30%. So, there's nearly 4 million people who voted Reform UK, and many of them are saying, well, only getting 5 MPs isn't quite if we had, for example, a perfectly representational or proportionate system, Saboch, Reform UK would have something like 91 members of Parliament instead of 5. If we had a perfectly representative system, Keir Starmer would not have a majority. He would only have something like 190 seats or 195 seats. So I think we're going to see a lot of traction in terms of this issue. The electoral reform is needed. But also, as you rightly pointed out, Saboch, I think there could well be restructuring of parties, perhaps new party political formations in the future.
Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing your thoughts about the recent UK general election. I can honestly say it's been a fantastic discussion. I could continue it for hours, but now our time is up. So thank you very much for joining us.
Many thanks to you, Saboch, for the invitation.
Thank you. And dear listener, thank you for being with us. Please stay tuned for the upcoming Votes and Seats episodes. Goodbye, everyone.